So people have been yelling grow up at us a lot lately, and it's in a really weird context. Maybe you've been hearing grow up a lot too, and maybe you'll recognize the context. Quick background, we recently made a video about the author Neil Gaiman and how there's really good reason to believe he committed sexual assault, and so we do believe that. And distributed through the general excuse-making and denial and apologia that you'd expect was a theme. People yelling grow up at us. All apparently independently coming up with this thing that we really needed to hear.
The problem is that you guys glorify entertainers to a hero status. You brought that on yourself. Grow up, grow up. Children have heroes. Adults should not aspire to be another adult.
Grow up. Acknowledging that people that move our hearts and minds have human flaws too is a sign of growing up.
You don't even know what this video is about. Go back to college. Heroes are for children. This is only a problem in an infantile civilization. The Infantilization of Western Culture, published August 1st, 2000. I'm not reading all that. What fucking hell?
You get the idea. They say we're not being realistic, that we're being immature, we're children either for having heroes or for thinking that everyone isn't a rapist, or for thinking that celebrities are perfect or that they're not human, whatever that means. Basically, if you've got an issue with sexual assault, you need to grow up. But why? Like, this bothered me so much. Why? Why grow up? And I know mean people being mean on the internet, blokes who disbelieve women and defend rapists. What's the mystery? They're just nasty. They're just nasty men. There's no sense in us setting up a whole Rube Goldberg machine in here with a chandelier and a net and then pulling the mask off the ghoul to discover that, oh, it was nasty men all along. Surely this is, as so many videos make obvious before you've even clicked on them, the fucking patriarchy. And yet, grow up feels so specific, so particularly fine-tuned to pick on certain vulnerabilities and flaws that we maybe all feel as less than perfect adults or as not quite normal folk. It picks on those sensitivities while simultaneously seeming to have so little to do with sexual assault. So we were curious and we asked some of our YouTube friends if they'd noticed, and well...
Grow up. The Hogwarts legacy controversy/boycott failed because the sane people have finally had enough of you terminally on the internet freaks. And
grow up, will you? If we were needed to ban every children's story that seemed outdated and problematic, open your eyes. Grow up.
Grow up.
So then, seeing that these examples also seemed to have something to do with naivety and wanting to change the world and pushing back against injustice, we were frankly even more confused. Now, why were all these people saying grow up? What are we doing exactly when we deploy insults like these? Why? Without just taking the answer for granted, is being grown up good, and why is not being grown up bad? What do people mean when they invoke maturity? It seems that if you put yourself out there with even the vaguest of gestures towards justice, boom, there will be a great deal of naysayers angry at you, waiting to criticize you in a very specific and predictable way.
Your children?
Exactly. They'll say that you're children.
No, Neil, your children. The baby.
Okay, yes. We have children, and we just had a baby, and we quite like the baby. The baby's brilliant. And it got us to thinking, why come people think that being childlike is bad? So, yeah. Have you ever said it? Yelled at someone, grow up! Or said it sincerely like, I think you need to grow up. I have. So I'm guilty as charged. And I think a lot of us have. I think it's a very normal put down. It's possibly the most succinct way of saying, I big and good, you small and bad. But that doesn't mean it's ineffective. It's quite maddening and sometimes pretty hurtful and usually incredibly frustrating to get these comments. And I think it's fair to say they're difficult to counter. Let's look at this example.
You are simply children who can't fathom the fact that people are multifaceted. I mean, dude, your hair says it all.
This is in response to a video about credible rape allegations. What kind of person looks at the despair and anger that inevitably follows a high-profile sexual assault case and says, grow up?
Don't you wave your hand at me. I wave my hand at you.
When you grow up,
When I grow up.
That was Senator Hatch dismissing a group of women who opposed his endorsement of Judge Brett Kavanaugh because Kavanaugh, you remember, credible rape allegations. So this is a high-profile example of invoking grow up to shut down a conversation about sexual assault. But it is also an example of grow up as an expression of power within a hierarchy. You've got a sitting white male senator. He's up here, operating within the grossly unjust system, and you've got this group of activist women, grassroots, speaking with nothing but their own voices, attempting to call the system into question. It seems to be the case that grow up, or more accurately, references to childlike behavior, are common when someone in a hierarchy is speaking to someone from a group below them. This is illustrated quite comprehensively by legal scholar and professor of constitutional law Ruth Kolker in her paper, The Power of Insults. In it, she argues that
the economic and political power elite has effectively hurled insults at civil rights activists, plaintiffs, and their lawyers to undermine civil rights reform.
I think most of us can recognize that activists, lefties, and basically anyone trying to create positive change in the world, those trying to push civil rights reforms, have to put in much more work than the power elites sitting on their status quo and Overton windowing their way into oblivion. But as Kolker says,
insufficient attention has been paid to how the power elite uses the cultural tool of insults to undermine these reforms.
As she points out, insults are part of a long tradition of class reproduction. She takes us back to the early years of the USA, to the 19th century, the time between the Revolutionary and Civil Wars, which was a particular hotspot for duels of honor. A time in which
many respectable, educated men eagerly avenged even the slightest of insults by repairing to the local field of honor and blasting holes in each other.
A lot of men, some of them very famous, were shot in some duel over some petty insult. I am Alexander Hamilton, and I'm a fragile little gentleman. But duels weren't universal. If some upstart from the lower classes happened to insult the honor of a gentleman, this would not be followed by a duel, no. This would be followed by beating the wretch with a cane or lashing the reprobate with a horsewhip. And funnily enough, not funny at all actually, this is also how children have been historically disciplined in respectable Western societies, in educational and religious institutions, up until very recently. It's arguable that, like the impoverished lower classes of the 19th century, children have historically also had no honor to defend. But anyway, insults. Kolker points out how, just like in the 1800s, those currently in power exist in a completely different world in terms of how insults work. She points out that insults function both as a distraction from civil rights reforms and that those insults are more likely to be successful because of the pre-existing weakness of the civil right in question. That is, if someone is lower on the social hierarchy, they have to do a great deal more proving themselves of worth as part of their response to an insult. Putting it my own way, I would say that if a disempowered person is dealing with the gallery, the audience, over insults and slings and arrows, then they have far less control of the narrative than the person with power. This means that the insult itself causes group-based harm. It fuels negative stereotypes about that disempowered group, and it deflects attention away from their struggles. So, surprise, surprise, there are countless examples of Trump doing this. Do you want to talk about Trump? Are we talking about this? Have we heard about this? Trump. This is the neo-fascist playbook. Insult anyone with integrity over and over and get the client media to report on it and ham it up and repeat it until no one remembers anything about that person of integrity except the insult that you made up. Most people remember Trump impersonating and mocking journalist Sergei Kovaleski at a campaign rally in 2015, flapping his arms and such. But what Kolker points out in her paper, and I'd forgotten this, is that that whole thing started because Trump had made a false claim that the Muslim community in New Jersey was cheering as the World Trade Center fell on 9/11, and Kovaleski, being a journalist, had published words that said, no, they didn't. The whole situation devolved into, will this boorish behavior derail Trump's campaign? Instead of spotting that Trump had used ableism to Trojan horse Islamophobia. He did it again when he mocked NFL players for taking a knee during the national anthem, successfully distracting from the major issue of police brutality against Black Americans. And again, when he described Haitian and African immigrants as coming from, quote, shithole countries, and describing Mexican Americans as drug dealers and rapists, all as cover for his administration rescinding DACA, a policy that allows certain individuals who came to the United States as children to stay in the country. Remember that? No, neither does anyone else. And all of that maybe feels like old news when, at time of writing, Elon Musk and a bunch of 4chan gobshite cronies are locked in some government vault pressing Control+A delete on America. But it's very relevant because the elite deploying insults and slander and dehumanization is at its most rampant and shameless right now. Returning to the nomination of Brett Kavanaugh to the Supreme Court, a Trump appointee, at a time when there was ongoing investigations into credible allegations of sexual assault against Kavanaugh, Trump, of course, mocked the alleged victim, Dr. Christine Blasey Ford.
How did you get home? I don't remember. How'd you get there? I don't remember. Where is the place? I don't remember. How many years ago was it? I don't.
Once again using insults to gain political advantage. That is, another conservative Republican judge on the Supreme Court. Now, is that quite the same thing as telling me to grow up? Yes. No. Kind of. It would be a mistake to think that insults are just the thing that the bad guys do.
Grow up.
There is growing division among general online leftish folk over whether using certain insults is necessary to express ourselves and show some urgency and strength and to make our points well and uncompromisingly. Or maybe insults are pretty much always hierarchy reproducing and Elon Musk won't see your body-shaming tweet, but your dad bod friends will. And obviously, there's always been an ideological difference between those who believe, to whatever extent, that the politics of identity should come second to and are a distraction from the politics of class. At its most cliched and stripped of nuance, that's a blue-haired wokey arguing with a tanky, both of which are insults that never seem to actually land or hurt anyone because, you know, they're very silly. Communists respond to being called tankies the way that gay people respond to being called sodomites. Like, what did you just call me? You're so cute. A tanky. Oh, I'm a sodomite. Yeah, I am. So given that bit of noise, there are actually only a few things that I can say definitively about insults. One, this is not a well-studied area. We basically can't say with any confidence whether it's praxis to go low or it's counterproductive to go high. We just don't seem to know. Another is, as I said earlier, that insults are a useful tool for power elites and that they are deployed by the enemies of the working class and of disenfranchised people to distract from and sabotage civil rights reforms. So it is interesting that Ruth Kolker, in her conclusion, doesn't fall one way or the other on the go low, go high dichotomy. She doesn't recommend that we do insults or that we do not do insults. She recommends a contextual approach. She suggests that we ask, what is the context of the insult? What are we trying to achieve? And I think that's smart. Adding to that, I can infer from her paper that it might be smart for us to hold onto and focus on the original struggle before the Trumps and Musks of this world turn any given emancipatory thing into a nonsense ad hominem game. So we should learn from what happened with Sergei Kovaleski and keep our eyes on the goal as it existed before all the distraction tactics. But importantly, as much as we don't know whether insults unambiguously reproduce hierarchy, we can say with some confidence that they reproduce social groups, in-groups and out-groups. Now, this is not necessarily a bad thing. It is not necessarily a good thing. It is a thing. As professor of psychology, Karina Korostelina puts it.
An insult is a social act constructed mutually by social groups on the boundary between them.
Which is to say, one of the ways that we create and reinforce social groups and the differences between those groups is through insults. Which got me to thinking, when someone says grow up, what is the in-group? And what's the out-group? It's not adults and children, right? I don't think that these commenters are accusing Sarah and I of being actual children, especially since Sarah was visibly pregnant and I look fucking old. Have you seen these new video essayists they've got these days? Turb and Jose Maria Luna, skin like baby angels. Now, they're not saying that we're children. They're saying we're something else, something childlike. And so they tell me to grow up, that everybody in the world is corrupt, so hush and shush. And if you're trying to push for justice, rest assured we can't be cured. It's just the world, so you better get more mature. Sarah, I feel like an awful tosser doing all this Hamilton stuff. Tremendously cringe. So I once again looked through the comments and tried to find a theme. I know, I'm a glutton for punishment. But it was important to understand what grow up means. And then I remembered, I've said it. I have. What did I mean? And I remember, I meant grow up like be more Irish. Be more like me. It had been during a fight with Sarah about parenting, because Sarah's American and I'm Irish, and American culture seems to put romantic partners and offspring on an equal footing, whereas like Irish culture is a little more oriented around babies and reproduction. So we value the children in a family kind of over the adults, it seems to me. Sound off in the comments if you think I'm wrong about that, or if you think one or the other of those two cultures is repugnant. I think it's just a difference. At least I think it's just a difference when I'm not arguing with someone about it. But when someone else is saying that my culture is wrong, and I have to argue that their culture is wrong, there is a tool at my disposal, well within reach. Grow up. There's only one objective answer here, the one that the grown-ups are willing to admit to. And with that insight, I could see that these comments did fit a pattern. Not an immediately obvious pattern, but one which revealed a lot about our implicit understanding of society and the world. Hierarchies we share in common so deeply and unknowingly that we rarely glimpse them. Grow up, as it turns out, is a very special kind of insult. But in order to understand why, we need to move on to the next most obvious question. Why is it even a problem to be childlike? Why is this an insult? Why is it bad? Why? Of all of the possible ways that we could group people together, do we hate this group? Children. So why get bent out of shape about being told to grow up? No, this is actually bollocks. This is actually bollocks, because by the time we get to the conclusion, we're not going to be talking about insults at all. It's like a red herring, you know?
Why don't you talk about something positive? Insults are just the negative bit. We need something uplifting.
I mean, look, no, we're going to talk about nice, hopeful, love things. It's just that the first comment that we're going to get is going to be, why are you talking about this when the world is on, this shouldn't be here, sweetheart. Why are you talking about childism when, like, you know, we're all going to die? I don't mean it, I'm sorry.
Besides, if we set ourselves up to only talk about the worst things, that's all we'll ever talk about, and people still won't be happy. You're getting too caught up in the commenters again. Just talk about children. Have you noticed that it's kind of socially acceptable to say you hate children? Or at least to say you don't like them? It's definitely socially acceptable to say that you don't want them around, to shoot a look of disdain at a traveling companion because you've spotted a baby on an airplane, or to judge the parenting of a child who's crying at the grocery store, or to suspiciously keep an eye on a group of teenagers at the movies. Adult-only spaces are normative, and even spaces which allow children do so only if they're well behaved. Is it socially acceptable for a crying baby to be in a fancy restaurant, or would you expect that their mother would whisk them out until they calm down? Maybe judge her for bringing a baby there in the first place? Look it up. Search the phrase, "I hate children," because I did that, and it wasn't good. People are mean. People are mean to babies. I found screeds at various levels of professionalism, disliking children for being boring or loud, disliking them for taking up space, blaming parents for being too lax about discipline, opining that children should not be allowed in public until they learn to act properly. So here's an example. A paper out of Australia documented that during a public debate about whether dogs should be allowed in cafes, the conversation quickly turned from dogs, who were ultimately deemed fine, to children, who were seen as the real threat to peace, enjoyment, and public order. The paper quotes one person's take on the matter.
I'd really like to see it go further and remove all children from public areas. Holiday spots and travelling options should be classed as for and not for children. Make these disgusting things travel in their own special carriages and planes and live in their own areas. The world would be a much better place if all children were just locked up until they were old enough to behave.
This idea that children, a class of people, should be confined to private spheres is somehow not controversial. For young children, this discrimination is justified by evoking their disruptiveness or vulnerability, either that they're too unruly to be allowed access to public space, or that they're too vulnerable, easily corrupted, or stealable, or otherwise hurt by being allowed in public. Older children, however, are not seen as vulnerable, but instead as criminal. As one paper puts it,
after around age 12, adult society recognizes children, particularly children of color, no longer as helpless pieces of property, but instead as reckless criminals devoid of any sense of responsibility or understanding of their lives. As a result, young people are driven out of public space.
Teenagers are routinely overtly profiled or kept from accessing public space. Think of the mosquito, a device which emits a high-pitched ring which teenagers can hear but adults can't. Installing the mosquito in parks or outside of buildings prevents teenagers from loitering, the crime of appearing in public without spending money. This is a particularly impactful limitation for teenagers who tend to have very little money and very few places to go. The mosquito is widely used in Australia, North America, and Europe, despite the fact that it contravenes articles on human rights from both the European Convention on Human Rights and the International Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights, and that it's capable of causing children physical harm with symptoms such as dizziness, headache, nausea, and sensory impairment. The risk is greatest for non-speaking children and infants who may be exposed to the sound for prolonged periods of time by parents who can't hear it themselves, and so they don't know why their child is in distress. And yes, this bias against children is impacted by other mechanisms of marginalization, especially race and class. Spaces that privileged children can access freely, like parks or schools, are often inaccessible to children from minority groups. Here in Ireland, traveller children are technically invited to attend public schools, but they face persistent discrimination, ranging from more benign erasure, their culture and language is absent from the Irish curriculum, to the more extreme forms of hostility from classmates and teachers. The result means that traveller children are incentivized to leave school at an early age. As one traveller put it,
"My parents wanted me to go to school, but because of the discrimination that there was in secondary school, I left after 6 months of secondary school. I just couldn't stick it. I was really good at school. I was never in trouble. I was never sent home. They used to call me n***er. You're a dirty j***. Go wash yourself."
Racialized children are, in fact, frequently denied childhood altogether.
Racial bias treats black children as physically stronger, more sexually knowledgeable, less innocent, less sensitive to pain, and more culpable than white children. This exclusion shows that entitlement to the ideal of childhood is not a given, but is instead a privilege that is largely exclusive to white children.
This is something we should all be familiar with through high-profile cases, like 12-year-old Tamir Rice, who was playing with a toy gun in a park when police officers shot him, or Trayvon Martin, a 17-year-old walking in public, shot by a vigilante for the crime of walking home from a convenience store. The man who shot him, George Zimmerman, who in his spare time paints images like this, was acquitted of all charges. The jury clearly agreeing that an unarmed black child walking out of a store constituted behavior suspicious enough to justify murder. Seemingly paradoxically, black adults are often viewed as more childlike, showing the mutability of these categories, how we invoke adulthood to make racialized children appear dangerous, but invoke childhood to make adults seem as if they're undeserving of rights. In either case, we're using age as a mechanism of control and terror. But thankfully, there's a philosophical movement meant to question the morality of this assertion. It's called Childism, and it's exciting, it's new, it's compatible with leftist goals, and it feels congruent with a lot of the stuff we've been exploring over the last couple years. But before we go on, in the style of better video essays, we must outline the term. So, Childism can refer to two distinct concepts. The first is discrimination against children. That's an ism, the way that racism describes discrimination against people of different races. The second conception of childism is a philosophy, one that proposes more egalitarian relations between adults and children. This is an ism in the way that feminism proposes more egalitarian relations between genders. In this essay, when we say childism, we'll be referring to the philosophy, to the foundational idea that children are people, and more importantly, the responsibility that we have to reconfigure society so that it serves the needs of both children and adults. Because right now it only serves the latter. And children are people. Really take that in for a second. Children are people. It doesn't sound revolutionary to say that children are people, but when you stop to consider the way we currently operate, it becomes clear that we don't see children as people. We see them as future adults, or almost people. This goes all the way back to Aristotle, who argued that an organism's mature form is its definitional form, fulfilling its actual purpose. All of the stages leading up to that are oriented to the goal of adulthood. Though rather than seeing this as an Aristotelian conception, we're likelier to view children through a lens of developmental psychology, as someone who has not yet developed their full capacity for empathy or their real eyesight abilities. This is how Piaget described children, as existing at various stages of being, where those stages are defined by deficit when compared to an imagined adult norm. And even if we don't consciously think of children as deficient adults, we often see them as beings in the process of becoming, who should be nurtured in that process by those of us in power, adults, until such a time that that child develops their full abilities and crosses the threshold into adulthood themselves, grows up. We often think of the child as a sort of evolution in miniature. First, you're a baby, and you can't see well, you can't speak, you can't walk, etc. Then you're a toddler. You can speak, you can walk a bit, but you can't really engage with long-term plans or complex operations. And then you're a child, then a teenager. Always there are developmental milestones you are supposed to hit. And finally, adulthood. You've reached your final form. This is a philosophical concept called recapitulation, that the development of an individual child mirrors the phylogeny of the human species. And like with the modernist misconception of evolutionary theory, we believe that the ultimate form is the best one, the one to strive for, the Blastoise. This is the reason people tell us to grow up. It's unseemly for us to still not have progressed to adulthood, but it's a mistake to view evolution hierarchically. Apes are not better than monkeys. They are adapted to different environments, and there's actually no such thing as a Blastoise. Likewise, social Darwinism was a misapplication of evolution, viewing some societies as more evolved than others when they were just differently adapted. The idea that you are not a person until you have hit these developmental milestones is essentially the same as you not being a person if you're non-normative and have, for example, a disability. Maybe you have poor eyesight like an infant. Maybe you have poor social skills like a young child. Maybe you have poor emotional management skills like a teenager. Ableism interacts with adultism so strongly that they start to feel like almost the same thing. The idea that respect is only earned via growth to this ideal of adult, a physically and emotionally independent being.
Childism dissolves this dichotomy of independent adults and dependent young children by emphasizing mutual dependency on various levels as a fundamental to human existence. Human beings' emotions and agency are shaped through relations to other human beings and their emotions and agency, as well as to non-humans, that is, animals, microbiomes, the climate, etc. This challenges the notion of liberty and freedom and raises the question, what does freedom actually mean in the light of the understanding of social and more than social relations as characterized by interdependence, and in light of children's experience and practices of this interdependence between human beings, as well as between humans and non-human species and materiality?
Childism asks us to stop equating dependence with subservience, but rather to see all of us as partially dependent and partially independent, in ever-changing webs of interdependence. Even the most independent person is still dependent on human society, and any period of relative independence is going to be brief, sandwiched between starting off as babies and experiencing increasing forms of disability. So why not abolish the hierarchy and embrace the fact that nothing we do is ever really independent, even for babies? As I've just learned with breastfeeding, it's a cooperative effort between the baby and I, with both of us learning and adjusting for the other in order for it to work. It's not something that I can impose on the baby. Childism, at its most basic, points out that children are people. Children are people. My baby is a person with a physical experience of the world and a social experience of the world. They have needs that differ from adult needs, and that does not make those needs any less important. They have a right to express themselves socially, without that expression being taken as distasteful, without their social experiences, needs, or self-expression being reduced to some inconvenience for whatever adults are nearby. So, if we are really ready to wrestle with this, what would it look like? To say that children have rights, that babies have rights. In some ways, it makes us rethink what we mean by rights, because I don't think my infants should be casting a ballot in the voting booth. Not only because I don't think that that would benefit society, but because I don't think it would benefit them. I don't think that when a kid wants to exclusively eat ice cream, their parent is violating their foundational human rights if she makes them eat some carrots. But those examples reflect a misconception of rights that is very individualistic. And taken to their extreme, they lead us to some very uncomfortable places. I frequently cite Firestone, de Beauvoir, and Foucault on this channel, and while I really like a lot of their work, they all tackle this phenomenon and end up in, frankly, the wrong place. All of them are uncomfortable with hierarchy, and all of them want children to be our equals, but they seem to get stuck on the idea that treating children as equals involves giving them free rein, because in many ways they conceive of freedom as the benchmark right, and some of their writing gets unconscionable when they, to different extents, explore this in the context of adult and children sexual relations. And I know that all philosophy when taken to an extreme can sound problematic, but Simone, Shulamith, Michel, that ain't it. So what if instead of valuing freedom or independence as the ultimate benchmark of respect, we pick different rights, like care, the right to be cared for, the right to have one's needs met. The right is the same whether we're talking about an adult or a child. We all need shelter, food, connection, or what about the right to community? So the right to have your needs be considered when making group decisions, the right to access spaces, the right to have your voice heard, the right to be a participant in the world rather than just have the world impact you. So how would this look? Well, I'm an immigrant, and so my assumptions about how life works get challenged all the time, because certain aspects of life work quite differently here in Ireland, and children are treated much differently here than they are in the US. As an example, let's look at that very Irish center of community, the pub. Pubs have the same components as bars in the US. They may have racks of hard alcohol, they may have televisions playing sports, they may have music, they certainly have the regulars who may or may not have substance use disorders, but they also have children. And not even necessarily the well-behaved children, but children who run around underfoot, children who cry, children whose parents aren't reining them in at all. Last year, I wandered into the pub, not realizing that it was confirmation season, and I found tons of kids. They were dressed up in their best outfits, running from one end of the pub to the other, shrieking happily while their parents got sloshed. This wasn't a private event. The pub wasn't rented out. It's just socially acceptable here for kids, even kids hyper on sugar and special event energy, to share a social space with adults. Children here are closer to having the right to community recognized. Another example, let's look at Japan. The extent to which the built environment is structured to meet the needs of children is really different there. I remember moving to Japan and seeing for the first time a 5-year-old confidently walking down the sidewalk alone, not a parent in sight. Having been a preschool teacher in the US, walking my classroom anywhere outside of the building was terrifying. An event we minimized as much as possible, but in Japan, even in major cities, kids walk alone. Don't mistake this for the idea that Japanese children are more mature or better behaved. Instead, Japan has cultural and structural differences which allow children to be out in public. The sidewalks are broad and generous. Speed limits are low. Children are taught to raise their arms as they cross the street in order to make themselves more visible. But all the same, drivers expect children to be in the crosswalks, so they watch for children in the crosswalks. During times when children are likely to be commuting to or from school, networks of volunteer adults place themselves along well-traveled routes so that they can watch out for anything dangerous. There's a popular Japanese TV program called Hajimete no Otsukai, which documents the rite of passage of children going on their first solo errand. So cameramen follow these children ranging from ages 2 to 5 as they navigate crowded city centers or wild rural countrysides to bring home a packet of fish or to bring cookies to their grandma. They do this completely on their own, and the show is really, really charming. I would recommend you watch. Public infrastructure in Japan is designed to some extent with children in mind. This feels very different from how we live in the English-speaking world. As one paper puts it,
parents across socioeconomic backgrounds in Western cities consider public space unsafe for children, a concern fueled by media hype around stranger danger and an increasingly risk-adverse society. Hence, children who are still seen out and about in the street without an adult are often regarded with a mixture of suspicion and worry. These paradoxical positions share a view that children should remain in child-friendly places such as school, home, organised after-school activities, or the playground.
This was from a research paper called No Messing Around, which looked at how children view public spaces in Dublin. So don't let my romantic view of the pub influence you too much. Children here are still quite marginalized when it comes to access to public spaces beyond those explicitly carved out for them with special deterministic functions, like a formalized playground with literal boundaries versus a large car-free avenue, which would facilitate more free, creative play. And God, does Dublin need that? I'm sure many people from the US who've been to Ireland, and by Ireland they just mean Dublin, are thinking, but isn't Dublin just idyllic? And that's precisely the problem. Dublin is so solely focused on tourism, on presenting this quaint little twee image of Ireland so that it can extract as much money as possible from said tourists, that it fails locals in general, and especially fails children. A few years ago, security at the Temple Bar, a pub famous for having the most expensive drinks in Ireland, and for being a place that no self-respecting Irish person would ever set foot in, well, they got upset that children, a 13-year-old and 16-year-old specifically, were skateboarding on the pedestrianized street outside of the pub. So, you know, being in public, using the street, presumably making the atmosphere less conducive to selling 30-euro pints or whatever. So now the pub is also famous as one where the security guards assault children for having the audacity to play in the public space. Seriously, boycott the Temple Bar. But it's grim in other places too. A paper on children in urban spaces focused on a neighborhood in LA, specifically the neighborhood around South Central Avenue, Southeast Los Angeles, which is a primarily low-income, high-density area where residents are majority Latin American and Black. Children are marginalized in the same way that we've mentioned before. Few places to congregate, streets that are unsafe for commuting, etc., you get the idea, but also by factors unique to the area, like through criminalization and institutionalization. The paper's author, Meredith Aboud, documents how children move through regimented spaces each day. The majority of children go to after-school programs, which means that they are in an institutional setting from 7:30 a.m. until 6 p.m. each day. But when surveyed, only 9% of fifth graders like their after-school programs. And based on Aboud's writing, I don't blame them for disliking them.
The children in the program are, for the most part, institutionalized, disciplined, and controlled. Students are commonly told to put their hands on their heads until the room is silent, often for upwards of 20 minutes, or told that they cannot go play until they learn to make a perfectly straight line, meaning they are often standing still in a line for 15 minutes until they are released and given permission to play. Students who misbehave because they refuse to silently work on their homework or do not put their hands on their head for the entire 5 minutes are benched and spend the majority of the 3-hour block sitting alone with their heads down. If they are lucky, they just have to pick up 50 pieces of trash, as if they are convicted criminals serving probation. Remarkably, however, students rarely question the hyper-disciplined environment because they cannot conceive of anything else. In a built environment that constrains their play, autonomy, and freedom, where police can search children and youth without cause, and where more money is spent on prisons than schools, children often do not even realize they can ask for or expect anything more.
I think it's particularly noteworthy that this demographic of children is also primarily made of children of color. Children who are not awarded the same premise of helpless innocence as their white peers. As a paper on Black girlhood puts it,
racialized gender and sexuality, i.e. Black genders and sexualities, in and under white supremacy and colonization, negate and obliterate the very idea of the subject position and the categories of child, childhood, girlhood, and human. In tow of such configurations is the denial of innocence in the traditional sense of the word, where blackness blots out naivety, not knowing, and exemption from responsibility.
Or to put it more crudely, children of color aren't given the presumption of innocence that white children are routinely granted. We are dominating and subordinating young people just because we can. And in the cases of racialized children, we are even more cruel and harsh, potentially creating a scenario where kids go from institutionalization on the basis of their age to institutionalization on the basis of their race, the school to prison nexus. And I ask you genuinely, is this how we want to treat people? Is this how we want our society to run? Have you heard the baby in the background? Neil actually just ran out with them, but I think you might have heard a little bit of it. They're here. And we're not doing that because we're showing off. I mean, maybe you think that I'm trying to monetize them or make a shift to mommy blogger, but I'm not, don't worry. I don't plan to make videos which feature them. We're not that sort of channel. And like many of you, I would worry about the ethics of exposing someone to a public life that they didn't consent to. But this is also my job. And I think children should be allowed at workplaces. And I know there might be some loss of productivity. There's been some loss of productivity today. And sure, maybe not every job, certainly not the dangerous ones. But the system we have now requires institutionalization. The system we have requires carers to either give up their careers entirely to focus on their children or to segment their day into sections where they're isolated from their children and their children are in care. And I don't want to do either of those. I really like that most European countries have generous maternity leave, but I'd also be pretty miserable if I spent every second of maternity leave focused solely on the baby and completely neglecting my own need for intellectual stimulation or to participate in society. Babies should be allowed in public for their own sake, but doing so would allow their parents to maintain their public access as well. And that's why the baby's here, because they're a newborn and they can't be left alone, because I'm breastfeeding every few hours, because I don't want to put them in daycare. And if you take me less seriously as a thinker or as a professional because I've got a baby strapped to my chest, that's your adultism showing. Everything I've discussed today gets extra depressing when you see what children actually do want and how easy it would be for us to give it to them. When they're asked, children want to be integrated and valued in their communities. They want to feel safe, and they want to be able to move through their neighborhoods. They want to be able to conduct a variety of activities like playing sports or exploring. They want public art. They want green spaces. They want tangible interactions with nature. They want spaces where they can meet up with their peers. And this one was especially heartening, spaces where they can mix with kids from different ethnic and religious backgrounds than their own. So like, they want what we all want, but shaped like them, usable for them, public sculptures that they can climb on, adequate lighting for dark areas, bird feeders, graffiti walls where they're allowed to paint, seating protected from the elements. Doesn't that sound nice? I hesitate to give many concrete examples of what changes that we should make for children because I'm not a child. I'll just be designing around an idyllic image of a child, but children aren't an idea, they're a cohort. They can tell us what they want. We should invite children to the table, and not tokenistically, but with the intention of actually engaging and taking them seriously. Otherwise, we'll keep perpetuating an unfair adultist framework. As Abood puts it,
if children and youth do not have a way to empower themselves and shape their communities, they will remain victims of an adult world that has continuously demonstrated that it does not care.
I like children. I like having children sharing my commute. I like having children running underfoot at the pub. I don't think children should be confined to a narrow range of child-friendly spaces like fenced-in playgrounds. But whether you like or don't like children shouldn't matter, because they're people. They have just as much right to be in public life as you do, regardless of your feelings on that matter. We can't make anyone watching care about children. We can't make it... Neil, what happened?
I don't know. We don't have Philosophy Tube's budget, do we? Recently, I spent some time in a maternity hospital. It was interesting. There was an atmosphere of tension and of excitement and magic, actually.
and horror and grossness and mundaneness and occasionally tragedy. We had some time to soak up all of it. Sarah was in there for almost 10 days having the baby. Her labor had to be induced, and unfortunately, it wasn't a very successful induction, and little Babog had some trouble coming out into the world. Basically, contractions, but no dilation, no progression, just a little baby stuck in there, getting squished by a womb, displaying increasingly distressed and distressing vital signs. And of course, Sarah in absolute agony, but kind of for no reason. We had very good care. There is very good maternity care in Ireland. And that was particularly striking for Sarah, coming from the States, where there are statistically poor maternity outcomes. In fact, the death rate isn't just high in the US, it's actively increasing. And it felt like the staff there in Galway, a combination of doctors, nurses, medical students, and midwives, all were fully in it. Hearts invested, life purpose being fulfilled. At least from my perspective, it felt like, and I maybe come across as a little bit of a wanker putting it this way, but it felt so authentic. It's just such an authentic experience having a baby. I mean, when they held up our baby, our new shining nexus of unimaginable potential and beauty, and the boundaries of reality were as wishy-washy as my tear-veiled vision, and the force of love itself, which had taken such a deep breath, finally exhaled, it felt authentic, you know, like it felt like something was happening. But anyway, that's not the point of the story. There was a different bit to that bit. There was a bit where I stood outside of the hospital and I was holding burritos. I just bought these mediocre burritos, right? And I felt as I stood there that I was standing between two very different worlds. On the one side was this magical hospital place where people fulfilled their life's purpose. This really rather difficult and involved and body horror infused and emotionally fraught business of birth and medicine and care. And on the other side, past the pedestrian crossing and the busy road, was Tesco and burritos and chain pubs and moneylenders. And we're sort of expected to think that these two are the same world, and that in fact the hospital world depends for its survival and viability on the Tesco and burrito and moneylender world. But this is of course not true. We've been caring for each other for a lot longer than we've been selling assembly line burritos. Ireland almost has a public healthcare system, and Sarah and Babog basically got free care for the duration of the pregnancy. And it feels right, actually, that should be something that society exists to do. It feels right that we all collectively should be simultaneously protective and welcoming towards Babog, and that we should be challenged in an outward radius from Babog's needs to reevaluate the world. It feels deeply wrong to think of their future welfare being based on money. And so, following that logic, it should be deeply morally wrong that any child or any person should have their future welfare be based on their economic value. Their value in reality, in a moral sense, is coming from somewhere else. So I want to circle the block of this childism philosophy thing with exactly that dichotomy in my mind. A society of children, which is a society of schools and hospitals and playgrounds and mutual interdependence and so forth, versus a society of adults, which is money and exploitation and Tesco and techno-feudalism. See, no matter how lofty or far-reaching or academic this gets, ultimately, this is still a story about a baby in the world, just like how your story is ultimately about a baby in the world. That's you. And you know, the movie 3 Men and a Baby is actually about 3 babies and a baby, if you think about it. Okay, so one of the things that we could accidentally do here that we might want to, not do, is to build a whole picture of childism that makes you think, oh, I get it. This is like, children are brilliant. The philosophy. This is wrong. That isn't it. That would be as silly as coming to the conclusion that feminism is women are brilliant, the philosophy, which I'm aware is a conclusion that some people do come to, and I wish they wouldn't. Some people get these sorts of things wrong on purpose, actually, and they quite actively throw a spanner in the works by responding to feminism with, well, men are great too, or are you saying women never do anything wrong, and thus participate at whatever level in a sort of ratcheting of misinterpretation that tends towards making feminism look silly and, much like our discussion of insults earlier, erases productive conversations about problems like patriarchy or gender-based violence. Similarly, people interpret critical race theory as this kind of inelegant, half-assed exaltation of non-white racial identities, or some kind of cult of negative Nellies who hate the whites, which you'd have to be pretty generous to actually interpret as misunderstanding, but I digress. This is important though, because as I now start to talk about the details of things like democratic representation for children, political participation for children, youth activists, equality for children imagined in new and concrete ways, you might find yourself somewhere on that spectrum of, but we can't really be serious about all of this. We're not really considering children as people in this way, are we? And this is just something I would ask you to be aware of as we go, because there is such a thing as invisible ideology. Ideas that you hold, that you didn't come up with, that don't even necessarily serve you, that you nonetheless reproduce on the behalf of your oppressors. This is part of what makes a status quo, however unjust and dysfunctional that status quo is, more comfortable than particular imaginable alternatives. In John Wall's paper, Can Democracy Represent Children Towards a Politics of Difference, he points out that history regards the political role of children in often more generous ways than we do now.
In the past, children have been kings and queens, played important roles in labor movements, marched with Gandhi to liberate India, helped desegregate the United States South, and been involved in one way or another in all manner of political movements.
Have you ever heard of the Newsboys' strike of 1899? It's a long and storied and controversial tale that we can't fully indulge here today, but basically, newspaper hawkers of the time, young men and boys, had a strike for 2 weeks, which effectively halved the circulation of the papers of both Pulitzer and William Randolph Hearst. Now, they didn't exactly succeed in their aims. Neither Hearst nor Pulitzer agreed to pay them more, but they did leverage buybacks for the papers that they didn't sell. So they successfully impacted their own poverty at the expense of those famously miserly capitalist c***s. And that's a win for the little fella. It's all somewhat faithfully recreated in the Disney film Newsies and the Broadway musical of the same name, neither of which I've seen. But Biz Barkley has, so you could just watch the video that she did about it. When I dream. Anyway, the news hawkers were an exploited workforce. Absolutely. And it sucks that children were part of an exploited workforce. But they also organized and used collective action. This gets referred to as youth activism now, because of course it's different to just activism, because they're children. It's so cute. They think that they're people. But I'm going to put a pin in this, and it's a linchpin. It's going to be really quite important and have something to do with youth activism and kids fighting for the whole world. You'll see, it's a whole thing. Because children, it would seem, are the cohort most patently aware of how fucked the world is, and just how urgent and necessary it is to stop playing adult games and unfuck the world immediately. But as I say, we'll pin that, because that is children outside of the establishment. See, no matter how other a group is, it's possible to picture them outside the gates, yelling and saying, "This sucks!" Even children don't get their usual erasure from that scenario. But if we turn our attention instead to children sitting in the big chairs, in the big rooms, making the big decisions, like Boss Baby or Blank Check or whatever, then it does start to sound a bit weird, right? If we look at the various instances where there has actually been an attempt to integrate children into democracy to facilitate their participation in the establishment, then our preconceptions, our cliched mental images, and our cognitive biases kick right back in again. But it's true that attempts have been made at this very thing, this more liberal version of representing children in politics. And by looking at some of the examples of children's democratic participation, hopefully it will help us to understand how, one, the issues with involving children in democracy are actually quite arbitrary, and two, those issues are also really similar to the issues that face everyone who gets excluded from democracy. So again, drawing from John Wall's paper, there's something of a shift around 1989 with the establishment of the Convention of the Rights of the Child, with various countries struggling to interpret or pay lip service to listening to children without that actually being a concrete legal obligation. You have New Zealand, South Africa, even Israel establishing consultative bodies for children. In more recent years, many countries go a step further by introducing children's parliaments, the idea being that adults' assumptions about the needs of children can be supplemented or challenged by children themselves. But as Wall and others have pointed out, there's a few issues here. He clears up the picture of democratic participation for children by splitting it into 3 categories: agency, interdependence, and difference. Okay, first, agency. That idea that you can just give children the vote, give them the microphone, give them something, give them agency. Some of the problems with this we actually touched on already. First, which children? That is, wealthier children from good schools are overrepresented in even the most benevolent forward-thinking of organizations. Agency has the problem of simultaneously holding open doors for certain kinds of people and closing doors for other kinds of people. It tends to be that those who most closely resemble the existing power elites will have disproportionately greater agency in political participation. If we're talking about adults, they'll be the sort of people who have the ear of the powerful, or they'll be part of existing institutions. They'll have access to education, they'll have property, they'll have savings, technology, other forms of cultural capital. And if we're talking about children, even once you've gotten past the razors of rich kids, the right kids, the white kids, you still have the problem that they will be the children who most resemble adults, and at that, most resemble wealthy and powerful adults. On top of that, you have tokenism, this idea that whatever diversity you have is mostly decorative. Now, at time of writing, most everyone even remotely left of center is crying out for some decorative tokenism in the US because it's better than the beady-eyed Ku Klux Klan bloodthirsty whitewashing evisceration of the Republican Party under Trump. And none of them have any eyebrows. But we can still, I hope, recognize that sticking some marginalized people in a committee does not actually emancipate them. This is extra true of sticking children in a committee.
As suppressed groups throughout history have found, citizenship in name can differ from citizenship in reality. For example, children in civic councils in the UK report feeling that, while they can participate and have a voice, these councils are really controlled by larger institutional structures that are run by adults.
There's a basic structural issue with the concept of agency. As Wall puts it,
the problem is that agency itself is a political norm with historically adult-centered biases.
So he outlines his next category, interdependence, a different form of participation that isn't contingent on hierarchical skills and knowledge and various forms of capital. Now, interdependence is a term we've already thrown around once or twice, but we might now take a moment to actually understand.
Children can be included as full rather than second-class citizens, the argument goes, if citizenship is broadened to include relational ties and social and political interdependencies. That is, persons simultaneously active independence and passive dependence.
We exist in webs of relationships with different dependencies. Drawing on other thinkers, John Wall points out that the idea of an independent participant in democracy is kind of a fallacy in the first place. Individuals, just like, your parents or your neighbors, the people commenting on our last video, they cannot necessarily grasp political concepts, economic or ecological problems. Clearly, they cannot grasp issues of public health and so on. We need each other in order to outsource expertise, and therefore, citizenship is a dynamic process of active independence and passive dependence. The idea of any category of person who is granted the respect to make salient political decisions because of that category has always been silly. Whether the category is landowner, or man, or white person, or fucking baron, or duke, and that idea doesn't stop being silly just because now the category is adult. Have you met adults? As I will really emphasize later, a key missing component of functional and benevolent democratic participation is education. This idea that we must learn or outsource learning would require a willingness to suspend entitlement when you don't know, and to admit when you don't know, to get good at accessing the experience of not knowing, and therefore knowing when it is that you are not capable of showing greater judgment than someone who doesn't speak English, or someone with a mental illness, or someone with an intellectual disability, or indeed a child. Sometimes you don't know better than a child. That itself would radically transform democracy. As Mark Jans puts it in Children as Citizens, towards a contemporary notion of child participation.
This citizenship of children is based on a continuous learning process in which children and adults are interdependent. In this interdependency, the playful way in which children give meaning to their environment has to be taken into account. The play of children cannot merely be considered as socially unimportant child play.
But there's still an underlying issue with interdependence, and that is that it represents a failure of imagination, and will tend to bring us right back to situations that favor adults. Usually, advocacy. As in, hey, group that is dependent on us to represent them, what kind of ice cream would you like with this legislation that increases funding for the police? Would you like Biden genocide? or Harris genocide. Interdependence, as much as it is very much along the right path, still has this implicit hierarchical order of things, in which power kindly squats down next to non-power, asks it how many sugars it would like in its tea, and then defunds the committee in charge of tea. In order to begin to get around this and other issues with interdependence, Wall proposes a third category: difference. And this is the real blow it all up, change our mindsets, anti-colonial, childist radicalism.
On this model, democracy means striving against historical norms of power for the inclusion of the greatest possible diversity of social differences.
This isn't DEI, this is fucking die. That's a bad joke. In its simplest form, we can say that an inclusive democracy should represent the specific needs of different groups in their specific and different ways, that those groups interact with and understand society differently to each other. This is the exact opposite of the Euro-Americananian norm that if anyone should dare to try to make a life for themselves in one of these golden imperial lands of the free, then they had better curtail their bloody culture and adapt to the many horrible norms in said land of the free, conformities understood through the rhetoric of its richest and most powerful and most cunt-like. Different cultures, be they from foreign lands or minority religions, or they're queer, or they have different needs or different neurotypes, or indeed they are simply children, should be represented in that difference by that difference. Different democracies should be different. Public spheres should be plural and many and different. And the people watching who already know a thing or two about decolonialism will know that what I'm dancing around is that the process of civilizing or developing democracy is the same as the process of conforming to the will and design of the colonizers. More on that later. Because in the more macro, all-encompassing, complex high end of this idea, some childists are proposing that in order to do fair representation and utopia properly, democracy itself should be deconstructive rather than consensus-oriented. And the role of the citizen should be antagonistic towards power rather than part of the mechanism that creates it. And the people watching who already know a thing or two about political anarchism will also be saying, yes, yes we know, more on that, etc. But for me, while that's all huge and inspirational, it's not quite substantive or actionable enough, or at least it doesn't yet compose a material set of tools and guidelines and things we can do. For that, I must draw your attention back to this here pin, because I promise there's actually a way of doing all of this. At least an imaginable way. In the meantime, what you're probably currently imagining as the democratic representation of children is probably still somewhat mired in tokenism and playing pretend, and ultimately, at best, advocacy with extra steps by adults for children. I mean, this essay is in many ways no different. It is adults, Sarah and I, thinking about what children need and speculating on what young people think and advocating for what young people would say if only there was some way to listen to them. Because let's face it, when you're not imagining these idealized 4-foot-tall activists and advocates who all look like Greta Thunberg and speak 6 languages, and you instead imagine actual children you have met, I mean like a crowd of them, it's just a cacophony of chewing gum and Monster Energy drink and references to Bluey, and it's impossible to make out a single word, right? No, obviously that's bollocks, but still, we do default to the adult-centric frame quite readily, and it seems to be an irresistible worldview. There seems to be a pattern to the excuses we use to rationalize the disenfranchisement of kids. Children can't engage with the political process. Children can't articulate themselves. Children aren't good at judging their own needs, and so on. And again, these excuses, when we set aside for a moment that they're about children, may be strikingly familiar to those who are disempowered in general. For trans people, for disabled people, for people with chronic illnesses. Oh, you're not understanding the system. You're extremist naivists and you're pushing people away from your cause. For mentally ill people, for pregnant people, you're not actually able to judge your own needs. Have you been talking to Dr. Google again? For immigrants, for refugees, for people on minimum wage, for anyone basically who stands outside of the establishment halls of power, no matter how perfectly you articulate your needs, and no matter how incontrovertibly you understand and know your own needs, you don't get to actually represent yourself. And it's familiar, right? that even the people that do come close to representing you are the richer, more educated, prettier, and more urban version of you. And the means by which the participants are then disenfranchised is of course familiar too: participation transformed into manipulation, decoration, and tokenism. In fact, much of the language used to describe disenfranchisement has the adult-child dynamic baked into it. Infantilization, belittling, patronizing. They're not making it difficult for me to draw a parallel here. And so, of course, when people seek meaningful change, they get told to grow up, which is particularly unfair on the cohort of literal children and young people who, when they grow up, will no longer have the political concerns of children. Of course, that's the idea, because having just gone full circle, we now see that the traits that make them children are the very things that we otherize and objectify in the first place. These otherized, objectified childishnesses are the things that become problems, whether they are value-neutral traits or needs or just phenomena peculiar to a cohort. The idea is, come back to me when you're an adult. Very similar to, come back to me when you're no longer trans, or you can lean in, or talk like a white person, or you can get out of that fucking wheelchair or whatever. And it may be, as ugly as it's going to feel, that the things you think of as annoying about children are exactly those otherized, socially undesirable, economically unproductive, and generally needy and vulnerable traits which your oppressor wants you to hate about children, wants you to objectify and villainize and pathologize. Oh, children on planes, children in restaurants, children needing things, costing money, being born, bringing more net misery into the world, taking over my friends' lives, as ugly as it might feel. It may be that your oppressor wants you to hate those things because those are the things that he hates about you.
I bet there's a part of you right now that's thinking, okay, this is great in theory, but in practice, this is kind of hippie nonsense. Maybe you're willing to go along with me when I say that we're interdependent. That makes some intuitive sense. No one does anything truly alone. But what if I ask you to picture someone with no agency? Someone who has no active independence. Someone who only takes and doesn't give. Like, what about infants? It's all well and good to say that relationships with older children are reciprocal. They can report on themselves. They can be reasoned with. They can help come up with solutions when there's a problem that they're facing, even if they still need your involvement for some of it. They can even provide moments of care for adults. Like, one night, I was up with the baby at 2 a.m. and my 14-year-old stepkid peeked their head in the door because they thought they heard me, and they wanted to offer me a cup of herbal tea, which, in that hazy, sleep-deprived state, it sounded like my absolute salvation. So they made it for me, and they brought it to me. I was up because I was breastfeeding, they were up because they're a teenager, and they did a sweet thing for me at a time when I really needed support. But they're 14. What about younger children? What about infants? What about my newborn? I think many people would argue that my newborn isn't even a person yet. Not really. They'd argue that newborns are completely dependent. They can't give back. They can't even reciprocate. They're just creatures of instinct with no thoughts or feelings of their own. They can't feel stress. They can't feel pain. You think they're smiling? That's actually just gas. Except it's not, because newborns do feel stress. And though they have a limited set of tools with which to address it, they can do things like avert their gaze from the object of stress in order to help regulate their heartbeats. Newborns do feel pain, something we didn't learn until as late as the 1980s, before which we were still sometimes doing surgery on newborns without pain relief and wondering why they were dying of shock. Recently, The Lancet, the world's most prestigious public health journal, had to put out an article calling on doctors to properly medicate newborns undergoing painful medical procedures, as the current practice of giving them sugar water doesn't actually address pain. And the repeated experiences of feeling pain, even in a baby so young, is so disruptive that it can lead to brain damage. And yes, mountains of relatively recent scientific evidence overwhelmingly lead to the conclusion that newborns smile, not just as a reflex, but as a meaningful sign of social connection. They do this as early as 36 hours old. That's how long it takes for them to observe their caregiver smiling, understand that this is a tool of social connection, and then reflect it back themselves. In fact, they are so good at this that even during the pandemic, researchers tested whether they could detect smiles under masks. The results of the trial showed that even with the mouth part of a smile covered, babies were able to observe the rest of the face enough to determine that they were being smiled at and reciprocate by smiling themselves. Babies, even when they're hours old, are already people. They're not just biological computers coded with instincts dictating when they eat, sleep, or poop. They're already learning, taking in the world, making connections with it. They are people, just as valid as any one of us. This isn't a moral imperative. This is a scientific reality. We see the same bias with animals. Serious scientists have to put out papers saying, actually, animals do love, animals do mourn, as if that were a revelation. A few years ago, a whale named Taliqua carried the body of her dead calf for weeks. Not because she thought it was alive, but because it was her calf. Because she was mourning. She's actually recently lost another calf and carried its body with her again. Long days pushing a dead baby around. Because it's her baby. Because she lost someone she loved. This has captured headlines. Isn't it incredible that whales mourn? But animal studies tell us that lots of animals mourn. Maybe even most. If you're brave, look up how dairy cows react when their babies are taken away to go to slaughter for veal, the standard practice in dairy farms, so that we can take cow's milk for ourselves. Listen to the noise that mothers make or the way they thrash, the footage of cows chasing slaughter trucks down the road to get their calves back. At the cat rescue I worked at, we dealt with a situation where some scumbag took neonatal kittens away from their mother, and the way that cat screamed for her babies, circled the house endlessly, desperately trying to get in. I genuinely don't know why we feel that something so obvious as animals love each other is surprising. I don't know why we need studies to validate it, or why for a century at least, we've dismissed the idea that newborns do, in fact, smile. But a lot of harm has been done on the basis of this misconception, or more cynically, fabrication. What if we go further and consider that the environment itself should have rights? Lawyers in various countries have tried to get personhood status for notable areas like the Ganges River or Mount Taranaki, but to me it seems that environmental rights are inherent in childism, even without considering the personhood of the natural world. Let's picture a small area of native forest here in Ireland. We only have 1% of those. Most of the forests you see here are ecologically dead farms of Sitka spruce, and the rest of the land has been clear-cut to raise cows and sheep for us to consume dairy and milk. But maybe you live in an area where there is some native forest, and that land goes on sale, and you buy it. Under an individualist framework, a buyer can get said land, clear-cut the established forest, and plant it with Sitka spruce to begin the process of growing, clear-cutting, and selling. Through a childist framework, however, you must consider the web of things dependent on that forest. The trees themselves, sure, but the animals, plants, and fungi dependent on those trees. And if there are humans who use the forest, you need to consider them too. Is this forest a play area for children? A picnic spot for families? How would they feel if you clear-cut it and fence it in? How would they feel about the increase in pollution they're going to experience from the machines that you're going to be using to clear cut, or the increased carbon release from burning wood, the increased soil erosion, or the runoff from fertilizer which will cause algae blooms in the nearby lake, killing more wildlife and making it dangerous for humans to swim in? Shouldn't you be obligated to ask locals how they feel? Is it genuinely fair that you are able to impact a community of humans and animals just because you have the money to do so? Is it fair that any of us can trade some socially meaningful paper money for socially meaningful paper deeds, and then just do whatever the fuck we want? Yeah, it might feel constraining to have to consider every factor before you act, because for a lot of people, that's going to mean their actions are more limited. For someone used to individuality, it can feel chafing. But it's also right. It's just right from a moral perspective to view things from the lenses of interdependence and difference rather than through power and capital, because we need each other. We need disabled people, we need children, we need a biodiverse ecosystem, we need a livable planet. Luckily, it's not up to adults to solely get their shit together. Many children are already acting to bring us closer to this more just world.
There are two key questions consistently raised by children and youth since the onset of the school strikes for climate in 2018 in the global north. Why study for a future which may not be there? Why spend a lot of effort to become educated when our governments are not listening to the educated?
You remember those protests? The school strikes for climate 7 years ago? Greta Thunberg and all that. Yeah, that was back when Greta was in the media all the time. But Around about the time that she set her focus on capitalism and colonialism, the media started to lose interest. And by the time she was protesting Israel's ongoing genocide in Gaza and getting assaulted and arrested by police, the media was so silent that, well... So that quote, there are two key questions, why study for a future, why get educated and all that, is from the beginning of a paper by Associate Professor of Pedagogy at the University of Stavanger and foundational thinker in the philosophy of Childism, Tanu Biswas. Biswas is like the decolonial, let's fix the future, education and the planet childist. Very interesting thinker. That paper is called Becoming Good Ancestors, a Decolonial Childist Approach to Global Intergenerational Sustainability. And it starts with some very good questions. Why study for a future that may not be there? Why be obedient on the educational production line to said non-existent future? Why value truth and knowledge when the systems and the people with decision-making power do not at all value truth and knowledge? To me, this feels like the same frustration and puzzlement I feel when I see everyone just carrying on as normal, ordering stuff from Amazon and booking holidays during this increasingly proximal climate crisis. What's everyone doing? What am I doing? What's wrong with all of us? This willingness to stand in the queue or fill in the form while the building is literally on fire feels really quite adult, doesn't it? But these troublemaking children back in 2018 created really quite the disruption of a really quite deceptively important thing, as Biswas puts it.
A pivotal institution of modern childhood and one of the foundational pillars for sustaining an intergenerationally unjust capitalist economy, the contemporary school.
Now, before I get into my own critiques of the contemporary school, and some people are already vibrating in anticipation. Over here, they're like, there's already enough conspiratorial anti-intellectualism out there. What are you doing, cooks? Don't come for the schools. And over here, they're like, yes, validate my resentment towards elementary school. I hate you, Mrs. Dougherty. But before we actually do it, and we will, we should make an important carve-out on behalf of educators. Because those who teach so often seem to be doing it for completely ideological reasons. They're rarely financially incentivized, underpaid US public school teachers, English as a foreign language teachers who actually like being English as a foreign language teachers, lifelong, semi-impoverished academics searching for one really specific thing and then discovering to their delight that it's actually a million specific things. Those people seem to live in a world of their own, with its own rules. Similar to the world I stood outside with my burritos. But I'm getting ahead of myself. How do we sort this out? Well, Biswas draws a helpful distinction between two concepts, education and schooling. Education, Biswas sees, is geared towards the future, composed of its own pedagogical aims and disruptions and endless reimaginings. We can all be engaged in education. Education is a foundational human endeavor. Schooling, on the other hand, Biswas calls a co-conspirator of capital, a place to put children that is like work and teaches them about work and teaches them how not to be trouble at work. She says,
a key analytical and decolonial step I took was to recognize Western schooling as a specific mode of learning, a conspirator of capitalism, deeply rooted in philosophical racism and contributing to a global epistemological loss.
If we're going to be honest, we need to admit that a large part of the purpose of education all over the world is employability. That itself is an injury against children, but it quickly becomes worse than that when we realize that this employability often serves the purpose of colonial wealth extraction, creating middle management for the colonies, supervisors, civil engineers, tour guides, and teachers to expedite the theft of raw materials and capital from the developing world. See, neither Biswas nor myself is being some glib lip service lefty when we say colonial. It is, in this case, a very real and material and fucked up phenomenon. You ever heard of the term school in a box? Yeah, it's not as cute as it sounds. Bridge International Academies, the world's largest for-profit primary education chain, has around 750,000 students in its schools in India, Kenya, Liberia, Uganda, and Nigeria. Bridge is the brainchild of two white American entrepreneurs, Shannon May and her husband, Jay Kimmelman. They saw an opportunity to undercut and outcompete the schools in the city of Nairobi for some of the world's most impoverished children. And then from there, they continue to spread all over the developing world. They successfully raised investment from some of Silicon Valley's finest, Bill Gates and Pierre Omidyar amongst them. As May herself said,
was straight commercial capital who saw like, wow, there are a couple billion people who don't have anyone selling them what they want.
In order to successfully undercut the existing private schools in Africa and Asia, they needed to scale up ridiculously fast and have irresponsibly low outlay. So like cutting the costs of classroom supplies, and teachers' salaries, which they can slash by having curricula centrally produced and distributed on tablets. So the teachers are high school graduates. This is what it is to be a school in a box.
With scripted lesson plans delivered by tablet, which detail what teachers should do and say at every moment of each class. The tablets are also used to monitor lesson pacing, record attendance, and track assessment.
Nicola Ansell's Shaping Global Education, International Agendas and Governmental Powers uses the example of another school in a box, Omega Schools.
A chain of for-profit schools serving 12,000 students from nursery to junior high school in Ghana. Teachers are senior high school graduates who receive 1 week of pre-service training and 2 to 3 days per term of in-service training. Both Bridge and Omega are among 22 private school chains supported by the Centre for Education Innovations, which is funded by the UK's Department for International Development. Despite the seemingly low cost of such provision, studies suggest low-cost private education exacerbates inequality, with children from rural areas and lower socioeconomic backgrounds underrepresented and a widening gender gap.
But it's not just low-cost crapness. Bridge was opening schools so fast that sometimes they weren't even obtaining approval to do so legally. The Kenyan government had to close 10 Bridge schools in 2014 for violating children's basic safety. At one school in Nairobi, at least 11 girls were sexually assaulted. In 2019, at another school in Nairobi, a kid was fatally electrocuted by an exposed live wire, and Bridge reached a settlement with the child's mother which did not require them to apologize. Shannon May and her entrepreneurial stroke of genius, Bridge International Academies, has received funding from the World Bank, glowing praise from the New York Times, and sits as the gold standard for the future of for-profit education the world over. And I'm just going to let that sit with you at this time, in this age, where we know that the plan is definitely not to make the global south richer, it is to make the poor everywhere poorer. Tanu Biswas, a self-avowed childist with a penchant for the anti-colonial, has other ideas about what the fuck we should do. A different, imaginable world. She lays out 4 strategies to reimagine education. In no particular order. 1, move away from capitalism as the modus operandi for which schooling is in service. Forget bullshit jobs and employability. Stop trying to create capital out of young people.
The paradox of a global education agenda geared towards generating human capital employable on a job market is that most of those jobs, if at all they will be there, continue serving the very economic system that is threatening the right to life, health, culture, especially for indigenous communities, and the best interests of future generations on this planet.
2, restructure and reclaim the spatio-temporality of global childhoods. What does that mean? It means that different places are different to each other, and education should take place in community, by community. What Biswas calls, quote,
adapting formal education to local realities.
See, schooling takes children out of community and assimilates them into standard capitalist aims. Colonial wealth extraction molds them in the Western norm of the employable upward climber. Examples like Bridge and Omega show that a lot of the time standardizing has less to do with meeting a high pedagogical standard than it has to do with establishing an acceptable lowest standard. Large-scale standardized education is often an homogenizing force, self-replicating and modular, and production line-esque. Even in the best of free education systems, often schooling is fundamentally putting children in boxes. This means that the differences between children can become a problem, and the differences between cultures equally so. This is why Sami children in Norwegian schools have their culture brushed over. First Nations people in Canadian schools, Native Americans, Australian Aboriginals. This is why traveller children in Irish schools don't get recognized as a different culture, except when they're being called slurs, of course. Like there's a story from one paper of a school in Ireland putting on an intercultural day, and they invited the media and everything, and it was probably the only time in the whole year that the Polish kids or the Ukrainian kids or the kids from Nigeria had their culture celebrated, but they had the traveller kids lumped in with the settled kids. Like officially categorizing them as not a culture worthy of celebration or even recognition. This absolute cultural vandalism that permeates global education and development is the same phenomenon that allows a couple like Shannon May and Jay Kimmelman, who, if you'll forgive just a wee bit of editorializing, are a disgusting pair of white, money-hungry, colonizer, Silicon Valley loveless cunts who think they can just rock on over to Kenya with zero cultural connection, zero curiosity, and just pump out shit standard schools, endangering children, ruthlessly profiteering, all for the benefit of their investors and the future investors in a more employable and exploitable Africa. While Biswas cautions very directly against forces like nationalism and xenophobia in embracing the community and culture side of education, she nonetheless encourages indigenous teaching practices and the school as a center of cultural celebration and integration, which dovetails nicely with her next strategy: simply make existing institutions and educational systems work. So here we immediately step back into the science of pedagogy, the best practices in education, the study of childhood. There are things that work. There are many things that work that schools the world over do not do because they haven't caught up with the recent research, or they're too expensive, or they would work, but other things would have to be in place in the community for them to work. And this is probably the broadest of all of Biswas's strategies, but that's because it runs the gamut of some really important stuff. Things like apprenticeship practices and passing on skills, involving the community in teaching, helping parents to help kids, to help teachers, to help kids, to help parents. As Biswas herself says,
existing institutional settings such as kindergartens and old homes can be used as intergenerational learning sites to combine education and care for children and aging populations.
So, finally, rethink the inseparable imaginations of childhood and education afresh. That is, completely blow up the invisible ideological assumptions of education. Blow up the aims of children's advancement through that system. Completely reimagine the life you want for these kids.
Broadening epistemological horizons on living a good life could enable diverse forms of intergenerational relating with children so that their learning is responsive to the broader cultural, socioeconomic, and political changes within their societies and beyond.
Like, we're going to be putting our little baby in school at some point. I don't want Babog to have their imagination curtailed by the goals that society invents for them. I want to engender a very broad idea and a functioning broad idea of what a good life is. And I want this child to teach me what a good life can be. And I want my dear baby's education to be an endless unfolding of the possibilities of a good life. So we're away with the fairies now, but in for a fucking penny, right? With a view to all of these strategies, Biswas proposes we reimagine education as community formation.
To foreground the intrinsic value of learning and realign the entangled purpose of education, economy, and community livelihoods with the overall purpose of life on this planet. I propose reimagining education by redefining development as nurturing diversity and expanding the scope of intergenerational life.
And I'm saying, yes, and let's reimagine learning and teaching and discovering and nurturing as the foundational unit of human existence. Like, go with me here. What are we doing? What is life? What is the purpose of this society thing that we've built? Is it line go up? Like, our investments are currently relatively well future-proofed. We're all very excited about AI. All it's taking is killing all the poor and filling everyone with murderous rage for outgroups and just generally a complete ideological brainwashing of whole generations of human such that they will lose their very souls. Price of eggs a little high, but price of gasoline surprisingly affordable, all things considered. Like, what are we doing? Even when we propose these alternate theories of economic value, and I'm not a Luddite coming from Marx, a lot of our work has a Marxist underpinning, but I'm actually just asking some childlike questions like, why? In order to produce alternate, imagined ways of structuring things. And a big part of the reason why I'm so excited by philosophical childism is because, well, one, we've been saying a lot of this stuff for years, and two, you know, I kind of always had a suspicion that children were people, but three, and most importantly, when I read those words, reimagine education as community formation, I was transported back to that hospital car park where I stood on the threshold between an economic world and a nurturing world. And instead of that nurturing world just vaguely existing in a cozy but directionless utopia, suddenly, in my imagination, we had something to be doing, learning and discovering and teaching. That already is a foundational human endeavor. What if that were the basis of our entire society? And I know what you're going to say. It's not. So grow up.
Well, I think you'll have a conclusion now.
Yeah, will I?
Will I have a conclusion? Because from where I'm sitting, we kind of just did the same thing we always do, where we raise the stakes, and it's all very urgent and important and inspiring. But you know what we didn't do, actually, is we didn't answer the fucking question. Why do people think being childlike is bad?
Neil, it's video essay. They have framing devices. We don't necessarily need to have an answer to that question.
Yeah, but we could. We could sit with people in their messy, embarrassing feelings about kids, like the actual source of the nasty things that people say, and we could like empathize with that and then come through it. And, you know, if we're worth listening to, we can still make a compelling case for this philosophy with some love intact or whatever. But if all we're actually dealing in is idealism, then it's just set decoration, imagined worlds, but not much else. I have a pet theory, a suspicion really, that a lot of people's discomfort with children is that things in the world, in this dark timeline, are so grossly out of whack with how things are supposed to be that children existing in this world is not as it's supposed to be, and so your relationship with children is not as it should be, and so by extension, the children themselves should not be. It's similar to the cliche, I remember when all of this was trees as far as the eye could see, except it's, I remember when childhood wasn't disgusting. And there's a great deal I can empathize with. The way that parents become unreachable, whether that's friends, like essentially ceasing to exist as their own people, or strangers seemingly parsing their entire existence around children, or it's parents asserting their rights as parents to dominate and dictate all of society up to and including their own children and you. I can sympathize with not knowing how to interact with children. It's not your fault that Western society, and particularly white American society, decided to be so age segregated and gave you every reason to be ashamed of your inherent childish qualities and therefore to race ahead and escape childhood, while giving you zero tools to then engage with the new children that, you know, keep coming into existence. I can sympathize with struggling with noise or with sensory stuff because I'm autistic. And I often find exactly those things rather difficult. I find it especially difficult at first when I'm interacting with a child that I haven't met before. And even though I think people would say I'm good with kids, I think I put on a good show and I put in effort, but internally I'm struggling. Adults would say that I'm good with kids. Kids can see through my bullshit. I mean, it's deconstructed, which is good. I can especially sympathize right now because I haven't slept in 13 fucking weeks, having a baby. I mean, this baby's remarkably chill, but that doesn't mean that it's not screaming and puking and pooping and all the rest, and in between, it's the most disarming smiles and chuckles you've ever seen. I assure you, newborns can smile socially, and it's just as fucking well. See, I'm Irish. I don't have to make sure that I'm coming across as positive or diplomatic. You maybe don't know if I'm joking when I say that all children are bastards. Pains in the arse. But you know, I'm actually doing something by admitting to myself that I have negative thoughts about kids sometimes, or that I'm crap with kids sometimes. I'm being honest and frank, and a bit ugly, not in order to escape a social responsibility, but in order to understand why I find that social responsibility difficult. Because I'll let you in a little secret here, I don't like adults either. I don't like any of my social responsibilities. I'm a recluse. My favorite way to talk to people is curated monologues uploaded to a YouTube channel. I know that people's discomfort with people, even with categories of person, comes from a place, has reasons that people think are justified. And my suspicion is that this growing discomfort generally towards children generally comes from a combination of our segregating them, our alienation from community, and our disgust more generally at the world that we live in. Which is really fucked up because those issues really negatively impact children. You and the children, you are oppressed by common enemies on all of those fronts. And I think if anyone was going to be disgusted by anyone, it's children that should be disgusted by us. And when children and those that remind us of children ask why the world is this way, how do we respond? Grow up. It's not a million miles away from shut up, is it? Oh my God, Sarah, Cormac, we've got a conclusion. I've got a conclusion now. I can do a conclusion. Conclusion. So why get bent out of shape about being told to grow up? It's no big deal. It's actually not a big deal. We're admitting it. 3 hours later, show's over, everybody, bye. Turns out, grow up. This just wasn't a big deal. It's not a big deal. Do you think we'd have gotten this far if we couldn't handle an insult or two? We made a video about being vegan. We can handle being insulted. And grow up isn't even really an insult, is it? It's just a thing people say. I mean, maybe it would wound someone if they were particularly sensitive or vulnerable. I mean, it's probably not nice to say, but an insult? Had you thought about that before today? Had you thought about what people mean when they say grow up? Had you questioned what people generally think of children and what people think of the qualities of being childlike? Had you examined your own attitudes to those things? Because in reality, grow up is an insult. It's just an insult which polices very popular social conformities. And people do really think very little of children and take a particularly dim view of the childlike qualities of vulnerability, dependence, imagination, and any insistence on asking the question, why? But like with grow up, these are also very popular social conformities. I'm still not sure where I stand exactly on the whole going low, going high thing, because I mean, in the ridiculous arena of politics on the internet, I've definitely fired off my share of insults, many of which I am frankly still proud of. But I know that I firmly stand by interrogating my own attitudes and keeping an eye on what those insults are about. These are insult-heavy times. Far from jewels of honor, it just seems like the lowest common denominator of Twitter honorlessness has taken over every other sphere of, in particular, American society. It makes me wonder what will be considered childish tomorrow? What level of injustice and violence and cruelty will we be told next is just normal? And that instead of fighting it, we should just grow up. What will be the next shifting of the goalposts, you know? So that even more of the thoughtful, curious people get mischaracterized as unrealistic children.
Drinking tea again. If you know, you know. In caring for a baby, I'm supposed to feel very adult, but I don't. That's because adult is a social construct. And child is a social construct. Like, we know this. Children face more lenient sentences in courts, so if a crime is bad, we decide to charge a child as an adult. We just wave a rhetorical wand, and now they're more complicit in their actions. And when a white 20-something athlete sexually assaults someone, we plead for mercy by calling him a college kid. The frame of child or adult carries weight and biases our perceptions of reality, and based on that misunderstanding, we make decisions that should horrify us, like separating calves from their screaming mothers or giving infant children medical procedures without pain meds. We have power over some people. Some people are weaker than us. Adults have power over children, but children's dependence doesn't mean they're lesser. The fact that they can be so utterly dominated does not make it moral to do so. And you don't need to like children. You don't need to enjoy the setting of an Irish pub during communion week. I would advise you not to hate them, though, because prejudice is stupid, and there are probably a lot of children who fall outside of whatever stereotyped vision you have of them. But I can't tell you how to feel. I can tell you that you can't discriminate against them. And that doesn't mean you can't get accommodations for your own needs. I think we can come up with all kinds of clever solutions for competing needs. If you're someone who really struggles with noise, then I think it's valid to have a designated quiet car on a train that someone doesn't bring a screaming baby into. But I don't think it's valid to have a child-free train car. Because there's some kid out there who's like a little baby Neil who also finds noise really upsetting and would also like to sit in the quiet space. And this is all provided that it's just one portion of a train and the screaming baby is still allowed somewhere because the screaming baby is a human. Besides, if you're from the States watching this, and I say this as a fellow USAnian, I promise you, you don't want to give Europeans the right to kick you out of public spaces on the basis of the volume of your voices. Because rights shouldn't be something we grant based on whether someone is likable or not, or whether someone has good social awareness, or whether someone is autonomous. Our little Babog is not autonomous. They have woken me up every few hours for the last few months to be fed, to be held, to be entertained, And I'm delighted to provide that. I'm madly in love. But it's not always easy either. Caregiving isn't easy. Watching out for the rights of others isn't easy, but it's moral, it's praxis. Next time you're with your child, ask yourself if you'd treat an adult the same way you're treating them. If you'd rip something out of an adult's hands, or make them ask permission to use the bathroom, or bar them from public space, or hit them when you feel angry. Because when you strip away the social construction of adult and child, you're left with human. And one group of humans who is allowed to mistreat another on the basis of their needing more care.
And hey, maybe we are being hippy-drippy and unrealistic. Maybe we're being glib. It's easy to be theater kids waving your arms and telling people how exciting something is, but it doesn't put out the flames of a world on fire. And while I'm keen, in fact desperate, to really do something, I'm also aware of the white savior advocate for marginalized group well-meaning wanker trap. As Tanu Biswas puts it, it is here that I invite readers to
pause the hasty urge to lean into performing the logistics of implementation.
But equally, this video might actually have some small impact on how sound you are to children and the amount of respect you treat them with. And that will materially affect some children, which matters. It's worth talking about. On the bigger level, yeah, we're pitching imagined alternative realities, but every material improvement was once an imagined alternative reality. I don't know what we do with the world now. I really don't. But in my lifetime, from my childhood through to my becoming an adult and a parent, not necessarily in that order, I know I've seen manufactured outgroups, designed disgust and hatred towards groups that were at various points not exactly beloved, but at least more accepted. I've seen that change happen in real time. And I've heard enough rhetoric from people who feel like finally they're free to just say that they hate kids. And it really reminds me of a similar celebration in other spheres. Finally, they say, we can just openly hate a group of people. People hate when they don't know any better. But that thing that would make that better, education, the thing that would make democracy better, the thing that would make public health easier and climate change taken seriously, that's a thing that adults reject because education is for children. And we seem to think that children only need education because they're so damned incompetent and useless, and they don't know how anything works. We think education exists to successfully transform children into adults, but it need not be so. We can imagine otherwise.
We can't make anyone watching care about children. We can't make you reorient your worldview towards interdependence. You're not even going to get social points for this one. The power structure is just so in-baked. But morality isn't determined by popular consensus. And clinging to the status quo isn't wisdom, it's a failure of imagination. As with any marginalized group, some of the changes that children want will benefit all of us. I know I'd benefit if I remembered that a sidewalk could be a place of play rather than just the liminal space between work and home. And I think, like a child, it's good for us to look at society and ask, why? Why have we constructed labor relations this way? Why have we created gender, race? Is this still serving us? Why don't we change it? I imagine we could do so much if imagining itself wasn't seen as uncouth, childish.
Imagine what we'd do if, when we grew up, we still understood ourselves as full of potential, as incomplete, as malleable, as brave and weird and unknowable as we were when we were kids.
Hey, Editing Neil here. Hi. I just wanted to say, we were pretty harsh on commenters and sort of on the concept of commenting, and please don't let that stop you from commenting on this video, because actually we often get very lovely comments, and it would be a shame to not have you comment here, so feel free. I won't make you self-conscious, just, you know, do your thing. Leave a comment below. Be clear, you don't have to comment. Just if you were, just whatever comment you were going to just act normal. Just whatever comment you were gonna leave, just put that. I'll go. Okay, I have noticed this one particular comment that's come in, and I did think this was gonna happen. So we didn't use the stage lights, and that was an intentional artistic decision. That's not a mistake.
It's not because we didn't know how to use them. We wanted to have, because it's like a video essay. It's like as if a video essay were a stage show. So we used the video essay lights to semiotically signify. It was intentional. I'm actually going to talk to Sarah about this because I'm a little bit annoyed. Sarah, we just got a comment that said that we didn't turn on the stage lights like by mistake, but that was an intentional artistic decision, right?
I mean, you didn't know where they were.
Yeah, but then I made the intentional artistic decision to not use them because I didn't know where they were.
Yeah, but that's not what intentional is, Neil. Like I wanted to use the stage lights. I wanted to find my light.
No, it's fine. It's actually fine. You can leave whatever comment you want, and this is the worst sequence we've ever had over the credits. Thanks.